What makes a good Assassin's Creed setting? Some requirements are no-brainers. There should be a city with buildings to parkour on. There needs to be some historical significance, ideally. It should probably look nice as well, at least some of the time. But one other factor that I think is super important, and I don't see a lot of people talking about it as much, is that a good Assassin's Creed setting has to be in the gray zone of prominence. In other words, the best settings usually aren't well known, but not totally obscure. Some obvious examples include the Holy Land of the Crusades, early medieval England, and of course the upcoming title Mirage, set in Golden Age Baghdad. More popular settings can still be great, but they tend to focus on a less well-known aspect. For example, we all know Vikings, but not early medieval England. We all know the Renaissance, but not the Borgias or politics in Italy. And we all know Egypt, but not the Ptolemaic era as much. By straddling the edge of well-known and obscure, Assassin's Creed settings can be prominent enough to draw people in, but also explore history in a way that even general history nerds can learn from it. So why do I bring this up? Well, I've been traveling and I am currently in a city that I think would make a great candidate for an Assassin's Creed game. It's in a time period that is well known, but the actual people, factions, and setting involved are relatively obscure. I am, of course, talking about the city of Gdańsk at the turn of the 15th century, aka the height of the European Middle Ages, but in a less well-known area, perfectly combining the familiar with the obscure. But why Gdańsk? Well, partly because I'm traveling here, but there's also some very interesting things going on around this time that would perfectly fit into the Assassin's Creed universe. So sit back and relax, after you subscribe and hit the notification bell, of course, and let me expound on this proposition. The city of Gdańsk, also known by its German name Danzig, is currently situated on the Baltic coast of Poland and serves as a major port for the country. Gdańsk also was deeply important for sea trade historically as well, and as a result, there is no shortage of historic significance to the town. So let's rewind the clock to the early Middle Ages, around the same time as AC Mirage and Valhalla take place. At this time, the southern Baltic coast was known for two major things: swamps and amber. The former, along with being heavily wooded, made the region difficult to invade, while the other, along with the proximity to the sea, made it a prize for trade and resources. The region of the Baltic that Gdańsk was in, known as Pomerania, was named for its pagan inhabitants living in smaller villages and cities between the Oder and Vistula rivers. In the mid-900s, the Duchy of Poland from the south conquered the region, although it was short-lived, and the Poles would consistently lose and reconquer the region. Pomerania was finally pacified in the 1120s, at the culmination of a series of wars waged by the Polish king Bolesław III, but right after his death 17 years later, Poland was split into pieces, and the realm would only continue to fracture over the next couple centuries. Gdańsk became one of those centers of power, lording over wider Pomerelia, the Polish name for the region. Christianity and Poles became commonplace, but so did Germans, immigrating from the west and spearheading the merchant class of the trade city. Another Slavic group, the Kashubians, closely related to Poles, existed at this time, and perhaps due to their similarity with their southern neighbors, they were able to resist complete assimilation better. Speaking of assimilation, Gdańsk and the wider region was having trouble with that, as incursions from neighboring German Brandenburg, the re-centralization of Polish rule, and the local Pomeranians wrestled for control through the late 13th and early 14th century. The question of who Gdańsk belonged to would only be settled in 1308, when another faction would enter the scene in force. This faction was the Teutonic Order, a religious group of Germanic knights that got their start during the Crusades in the Holy Land in 1190. When those crusades ended, the knights, still supported by the church, had nowhere to go, and no one wanted to give them land. After being kicked out of Hungary for attempting to create their own state, Duke Conrad I in Poland offered them some of his land to help pacify the raiding pagan Prussians in 1226. Initially answering to Conrad as a fief, the Teutons learned from their expulsion from Hungary, and with the help of the Pope were able to secure themselves an independent state in 1230 based in Torun. Over the decades they were very effective at fighting the Prussians and expanded to take much of Prussia, while merging with the Livonian Brothers of the Sword in 1237 to the north, who had been decimated militarily. The combined Teutonic Order controlled most of the Baltic, except for Lithuania, which remained stubborn. But like any military-industrial complex, once the war was winding down, they still wanted to keep going. And that is the problem the Order started to run into. Faced with a stalemate in Lithuania and all the other pagans really conquered, the Teutonic Knights had to find other fronts to fight on. So back to Gdańsk. In 1308, the Pomeranians asked the Teutons for assistance as they were once again being besieged by Brandenburg and the Poles were not available. The Knights came in and took the city, but instead of leaving, they decided to keep it and take over all of Pomerania, hoping to secure the lucrative amber and port for themselves. In their capture of Gdańsk, it is said that the Teutons decimated the city and killed 10,000 of its inhabitants, although the true number is unknown and it may have just been a handful of leaders. In the following decades, the Teutonic Order would actually go on to help rebuild Gdańsk and commission the main monuments that survive today. Check out the video I just did about this with the fortifications of Gdańsk, linked right here. But they also brought in many German immigrants from the Holy Roman Empire, changing the demographics and shifting it dramatically towards a German population than a Polish one. Nonetheless, the massacre plus the highly illegal land grab put the Order at odds with Poland, and when the latter merged with Lithuania in 1386, things only got more complex. Not only were the Order's two major enemies united, but with the unification, Lithuania had converted to Christianity, so there wasn't even a reason for the Order to exist anymore. But by this point they had outgrown their early benefactors and the Teutons lived on, supported by the Holy Roman Empire, which sought to weaken the Church and Poland while securing access to the lucrative coast for themselves. The date range that I am looking to have this game take place would be something like 1405 to 1420, 2 or 3 generations before Ezio, and about 200 years after the original game. This game would mostly center around a conflict known as the Great War, although now it is known creatively as the Polish-Lithuanian-Teutonic War, which lasted from 409 to 411. We'll get more into those plot points and characters, but first let's take a look at this map. For a map, there would probably be a few places involved, and the general structure might be more like Assassin's Creed 3 or 4, with a couple main city locations and a larger map to connect everything. The frontier map would probably cover an area from the Polish-German border in the west, the Baltic Sea in the north, Samogotia and Lithuania in the east, and go a bit past Teutonic territory into the Polish borderlands in the south. It would also be interesting to have side missions that take place in other parts of Europe, including Sweden, Novgorod, Livonia, and various German cities like Berlin and Frankfurt just off the border, and other places in the south and east in neighboring countries such as Bohemia or Hungary. As for actual city maps, 3 really come to mind, those being Torun, Marienburg, also known as Malbork, and of course Gdańsk, which is where a plurality of the game would take place, and since Gdańsk is the point of this video, we'll just focus on that map. Gdańsk at this time would have been a newer city, since it was largely destroyed about a century before by the Teutonic Knights, and large-scale projects began in the 1340s, only 60 years before we're starting. Starting with the geographic layer, Gdańsk would have 2 main waterways, the Motłowa River running north alongside the main city, and the Vistula flowing west to the north of the main city. These waterways were used to create moats and canals for protection and for powering mills. To the west of the city were some hills, and to the south and east were lower elevation swamplands, some of which were probably farmlands by this time. In terms of districts, the city would have a few parts. The surrounding countryside with the high ground as well as some settlement would be the largest, but the least populated area. Sync points here would likely be in two main places, on a hill to the west and atop a hospital church to the east, where the current St. Barbara's Church stands. Then we'd get to the young town, or Młode Miasto, which at the time would have had a couple of churches, but this area would have been less developed as it was only founded recently by the Knights. Here we would find a port on the Vistula as well as a hospital for lepers and the infirm, which would be on the outskirts of the city and in the kind of countryside area. South of this would of course be the old town, or Stare Miasto, which would be far more developed and house sync points such as St. Catherine's Church, the Great Mill, which was the largest grain mill in Europe at the time, and St. Elizabeth's Church. To the south of the map, we would find the suburbs, which is where many of the merchants and lower nobles would live, and would likely be the hometown of our assassin, although there wasn't that much remarkable architecture here by this time. Then we have the Teutonic Castle, which reigned over the city and housed the knights who lorded over Gdańsk. This would be a restricted area and may serve as the culmination for a first or second sequence kill. There was also a retractable chain here that cut off the Motłowa, kind of like we see in Revelations. Finally, we have the main city, or Główne Miasto, which is where most of the impressive architecture and hubbub would be. Places like the town hall and the St. Mary's Basilica would make up the heart of the city, and impressive fortifications like an early version of the Crane Gate, the Jacek Tower, and the Prison Tower would all serve as sync points and mission locations. The only real drawback to this era is that a lot of the tall buildings in Gdańsk were under construction, and in some places were actually cut short and finished early, as the Knights had rules about tall buildings near the castle. That being said, the tallest sync points on the map would likely be the Teutonic Castle Tower, the St. Mary's Basilica, and the St. Catherine's Church, all around 45 to 50 meters tall. We would have exit points to the west, north, and south, all leading to the wider countryside or Teutonic realm of the map. This map we talked about earlier. The major geographic feature here would be the Vistula River running south and roughly cutting the map in half, and there would be lots of farmland and woods and swamps, although the general geography would be quite flat. East of Gdańsk we'd have Oliva, another town settled by the Teutonic Order which houses the Oliva Abbey, probably also being one of the highest points in the countryside, if not the whole game. The Baltic coast would also be the site of some naval missions and opportunities to travel to other parts of the map, with the Hanseatic League, who were a German trade group that dominated the Baltic. Ringing the edges of the map would of course be the borderlands with Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, making these areas more intense, but also more important for the story, which we can get into now. Here's the basic plot I'm looking at and the themes that it explores. Our protagonist, let's just give him a name and call him Jan Pilecki, so he has a name, is a young assassin living in Gdańsk, and like most assassins we've seen in the series, he has revenge as a motivator for him joining the assassins, but his vengeance is more ideological and abstract rather than the death of an immediate family member. Jan was raised in a Polish middle-class family, and he grew up hearing stories about how his ancestors, who were some of the Pomeranian dukes of Gdańsk, were massacred by the Teutonic Knights about 100 years ago, and here's where the lore could get very interesting. The Teutonic Knights could be a branch or competing organization to the Templars, as they were both crusading orders who operated at the same time. This could make for a very interesting antagonist faction, and many things could be done to explore the early history of the Templars proper. But for the sake of the story, let's just settle on one possibility and say that the Teutonic Knights split from the Templars when the Teutons believed in exercising control over the populace in a more obvious way, whereas the Templars wanted to be more subtle. This makes sense historically since the Teutons actually had a state of their own they controlled, whereas the Templars had to work with other entities to be deployed or exert influence. So Jan, our young assassin, hates the Teutons and to some extent the German gentrification of Gdańsk, which they really ushered in and upped after their destruction of the city, which he sees as his rightful lands to inherit, if only that succession weren't interrupted by the massacre. So he joins the local assassins who fight the Teutons, obviously. We probably start around 1405, and we conduct some smaller missions in Gdańsk as Jan. These could include fixing some issues with the grain mill, which at this time was providing massive amounts of grain to Europe, collecting samples from lepers in a hospital to infect a Teutonic leader, and freeing someone from the prison tower before conducting some stealth assassination in the main castle. Eventually, Jan decides he needs to get other powers involved if he ever wants to free Gdańsk, and he starts at a weak point in the east, Lithuanian Samogotia. Here, Jan could play a role in instigating the Samogitian rebellion, killing Templars and cooperative Lithuanian nobles. A naval element of the game would also be introduced around this time, allowing for side missions and other missions to other parts of Europe, as well as a way to gain wealth and have some sort of stronghold or mansion or trading system that we've seen in other games. Meanwhile, this creates tension with the wider Assassin Brotherhood, who sees his moves as rash and extremely destructive. Assassins are supposed to operate in the shadows, and starting massive wars is not part of that. But Jan insists that since the Teutons are different than the Templars, and since they operate out in the open, that fighting them requires the same techniques. Jan starts to win over more assassins, and eventually he kind of co-opts the whole Brotherhood, or most of the Brotherhood, and advocates for a more militant approach, allowing for breaking the supposed tenets of the Creed in order to win the day, including killing German civilians if it weakens the Teutons, since they aren't really innocents, and fighting out in the open with organized military units. By this point, the Teutons have declared war, and there is a scramble to secure allies, which Jan takes part in. Jan travels to negotiations in Hungary and Romania and fails in these places, but also manages to secure allies in Rus and some Tatars as well. By 1410, the war really starts, and Jan joins with the King of Poland and Lithuania, King Jagiełło. Jan plays a role in the wider war effort, as the coalition needs to try and deceive the Teutons as to where they will actually attack. Jan carries out some missions like rooting out and chasing spies who try to report on troop movements, such as at the crossing of the Vistula, and leads his militia of assassins on raids into borderlands to misdirect the order. This works, but along the way Jan witnesses and participates in some pretty heinous acts against the civilians, which he initially justifies as saying that they aren't actually innocents since they are Germans living in these lands because of the Teutonic Knights, and they are part of the reason his native Poles are oppressed. After all, the Creed itself says, "Nothing is true and everything is permitted." The climax of the plot would be the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, and Jan would participate in this awful battle, maybe playing some role beforehand or during, like sabotaging the Teutonic cannons. Jan fights in the battle and ends up killing the Teutonic Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen. I'm sure I pronounced that right. Although the kill is more so a lance to the neck rather than a hidden blade. The Battle of Grunwald would be the most historically recognizable part of the story, as this is often considered to be the largest medieval battle in European history. After the war, Jan leads the victorious Poles into Gdańsk, and he liberates the city. Jan tries to take part in the end-of-war negotiations by doing more assassin stuff, including killing the neighboring German Brandenburg monarch, Jobst of Moravia, who may have been supporting these efforts, but he ends up facing down his old master, who has been leveraging the king for monetary reparations instead of taking land. They have a falling out, and a sort of Hatham Connor moment where the master lambasts Jan. He criticizes his whole worldview, especially in terms of his nationalistic identitarianism, telling him how the only reason he won at Grunwald was because of other groups, not just the Poles. He also touches on how it's wrong for him to think of the modern German inhabitants as bad, since the master himself is German, and how if Jan does take the Gdańsk back, then the Germans will simply see him as the oppressor next, and they will have the same ground to stand on as him. Ultimately, the Master gets his way, and Gdańsk is returned to the Teutonic Order. Returning to the city, Jan is dismayed at how the reparations of the war have taken a toll on Gdańsk, and he leads a revolt against the Teutonic Knights against the insane taxes. This, however, fails, and through the revolt he sees many people he knows die. He starts to reconsider his choices and gets to know some more German people, starting to ebb at his animosity, a trend that would have been happening throughout the game. 3 years later, conflict sparks up again between the Teutonic Knights and Lithuania, and the new Grand Master seeks to invade Poland. Fearing more conflict, Jan convinces many of the underling knights to not invade, since the war would be fruitless as the knights are still broke and low in numbers since Grunwald. Sadly, war still breaks out, and while some of the knights stay put in their castles, the Poles still invade. Both sides end up using scorched earth tactics as Jan tries to stop it, and in the fallout, even more people starve and die, with no gains on either side being made from the war. At the end of the game, Jan gives up his crusade for Gdańsk, and in 1919, 5 years later, dismayed at the whole fight he's been fighting, joins the Franciscan religious order and becomes a monk, although he will still carry out smaller assassin duties in the original, traditional way to help people and redeem himself. So this plot follows key themes of identity and identitarianism, a concept that has been largely dismissed in the series to date. Assassins generally are just magically devoid of philosophical ideas like nationality or religion in this series, despite these often being significant issues historically, and I think it would be an interesting exploration of the philosophy of the Creed, especially given that it takes place in Eastern Europe, which is where some of these issues continue to ebb and flow with time. In terms of historical events we see in the series, there is of course the Great War, which we talked about earlier, as well as the Treaty of Thorn in 1411, the Gdańsk Revolt around the same time, and the Hunger War, which continued the conflict to no avail 3 years later. Lastly, there is the introduction of the Franciscan religious order in 1419, showing that these other common ideals in history that Assassin's Creed just tends to ignore through most of the series are not so divorced from the Creed. Lastly, we can look at weapons and armor and such. I think that since this takes place in the Middle Ages, it might make sense for there to be some battles and conflict, similar to what we find in Odyssey, but in a more realistic way. I also think this has to be separated from the more assassin-y elements of the game, and as such, there might be a switch system, sort of like in Syndicate, but with the same person, of course, between an assassin loadout and a combat loadout. It obviously doesn't make sense that you could parkour and blend and sneak in full armor, and it makes sense that heavily armed and armored opponents would actually be very difficult to fight in Assassin's Garb, another thing we kind of just gloss over in most of the Assassin's games. We won't get too into it here, but for Knight's Armor and Armament, the height of medieval technology would be available, primarily weapons and armor in the German style. Eastern, lighter styles of weapons and armor from Lithuania and the Tatars would also be available as well. Protection would range from gambesons, butted or riveted mail, plated surcoats, early Gothic style armor with fluting, lamellar armor, sallet and armet style helmets, as well as full-on plate armor, again usually in a proto-Gothic or German style. Older styles of armor would exist as well, like great helms and kettle hats and all these things, since these would be far more common than the cutting-edge styles of German plate armor. Moving to weapons, we would see a variety of swords. Various types of long swords and arming swords would be available, as well as Hungarian and Eastern sabers. Poleaxes, maces, spears, axes, pikes, and lances will all be available, as well as crossbows and compound bows. For the assassin loadouts, the extremes of this would of course have to be curbed, and some cities in the map may even have bans on openly carrying weapons, so concealed carry is the only option. In more forgiving environments, bucklers and single-handed swords would be the most effective weapons. Daggers, mostly in the rondelle style, would be used as well, and armor would mostly be a light plate or chainmail under the robes. So that's the Assassin's Creed setting I would love to see in this area. I think being able to delve into full-on knights and medieval warfare would be a familiar and fun element in the game, and the Teutonic Order would be an extremely interesting plot point as well. In terms of downsides, the obvious one to me is that Gdańsk at this time was relatively underdeveloped, and the grand structures we can see today in the city were not even built yet fully. The city may be a little small, and the architecture and beauty of the city wouldn't be as impressive. That's where I think another game, ranging across a wider part of Poland, would be better in a later era, which would also involve Italian players, which we'll get into in another video, which could play into the original Ezio games to some degree as well, but that's for a whole other video. Overall, I think the setting works with the gray zone of prominence perfectly. The Knights and Middle Ages are a well-known topic, but the actual place the game takes place in is much less known, but still is important historically and keeps the game from feeling too formulaic like a game in feudal Japan or ancient Greece or the Wild West. So that's my bid for a Gdańsk Assassin's Creed game. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Let me know what you think of this Assassin's Creed style video. I wanted to find a way to talk about the history of the city in a more engaging way, and this is what came into my mind. Anyways, I hope you all have a good day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.